Just one more bridge for... If we want the bridge to stay up, we'll need to add a gadget between the trigger zone and the rotator to remember it's been activated. We can do this with a counter. So let's go into the assembly menu. Press square to open it if it's closed. And select the gadgets menu with X. You'll find the counter in the logic and processing section. These gadgets take an input signal and change it in some way before sending it on. Go ahead and select the counter. Its icon is a tally counter. Now that you can see the gadget on your IMP, hover over the microchip and it will snap onto the canvas. Press R2 or X to stamp the counter on the microchip, then press circle to unequip it. The counter gadget counts up or down whenever it receives a signal through one of its inputs. By default, it starts its count at 0 and has a target of 1. Once it reaches that target, it sends a constant signal through its counter full output port. Before we connect it though, let's tidy up the wires connecting the trigger zone to the rotators. Just hover over them and press triangle to delete them. Now press R2 or X over the detected output of the trigger zone to create a new wire. And connect it to the increase count input port on the counter. That's the port with the plus sign icon. When the trigger zone is activated now, the counter will go up to 1. And this is the important part, it will stay at 1 even after the trigger zone deactivates. Now hover over the counter full output port of the counter, which is what sends a signal when the counter reaches its target. Create a wire with R2 or X. Connect it to one of the rotator's power ports. Then do the same for the other one. Time to switch to play mode and try out our new connections. When you're return to edit mode and move on to the next step. Just one more bridge for Connie to cross. As you can see, we have another microchip on the platform, so let's open it up. Hover over it with your IMP, hold L1, then press X. Looks like we have everything we need in here. But Connie's an adventurer, so how about we make this last bridge more challenging? Adding a timer to the logic should get the adrenaline going. Once Connie activates the button, she'll only have a few seconds to cross before the bridge drops back down. Let's head back to the assembly menu. If it isn't already open, press square. Then go into the gadgets section. You'll find the timer in the same place as the counter, the logic and processing section. Its icon is a clock face. Now go ahead and stamp the timer gadget onto the microchip with R2 or X. Then unequip it from your IMP with circle. Let's take a closer look at the timer's inputs and outputs, shall we? You can see their names by hovering over the ports. The first input is the start timer. Once this port receives a signal, it will start the clock. The second one is the reset timer, which will set the time back to 0. Over on the output side, we have timer finished and timer output. Timer finished sends a signal pulse when the timer reaches the required number, which is set to 5 seconds by default. Timer output is a little more sophisticated. The signal it sends represents the timer's current progress. If, let's say, it's only halfway to its target, it will send a signal that's only half strength. So how do we connect this so the bridge only stays up for a few seconds? Well, we need the bridge to be raised when the timer is running. So create a wire on the timer output with R2 or X. Remember how we used the counter on the previous platform? We can use one here too. Just like before, connect the wire to the counter's increase count input. Then connect the counter full output to the rotator's power port. Time to see if it works. Click R3 to test it. As you can see, since the timer isn't connected to a trigger yet, the clock starts ticking as soon as we play the scene. The bridge goes up, but doesn't drop down when the timer finishes. That can mean only one thing: there's a problem with the logic. If you'd like to figure it out for yourself, feel free to check the gadgets and see what's wrong. Or you can move on to the next step and we'll go through it together. So let's take a look at why the bridge stayed up after the timer finished, instead of going back down. Remember how we used the counter earlier to remember the signal from the trigger zone? Well, now it's remembering the signal from the timer. So we need to make it forget that once the timer finishes. Let's go on over to the counter gadget and hover over the inputs to see their names. This one here is the reset count, which will put the counter back to 0 and turn off the rotator. So all we need to do is connect it to the timer. But to which output? Ah, there we go. We can use the timer finished output. Hover over it and create a wire with R2 or X. Then stretch the wire over to the counter and connect it to the reset count input. But we also need to reset the timer, otherwise the logic will only work once. So let's get another wire from the timer finished output and connect this one to the reset timer input. You'll recognise it by the rewind symbol on it. All we have left to do is connect the trigger zone to the start timer symbol on it. Another wire from the timer finished output and connect this one to the reset timer input. You'll recognise it by the rewind symbol on it. All we have left to do is connect the trigger zone to the start timer port so Connie can activate it. Okay, that was a lot of connections. So, before we test it out, let's go over the logic we've made. First, Connie activates the trigger zone, which sends a signal to start the timer. Once the clock starts running, the timer output becomes active, which tells the counter to count up. That then turns on the rotator and raises the bridge. Now this is where the really clever stuff kicks in. After 5 seconds, the timer finishes its count, which activates the timer finished output. This, in turn, resets the counter to 0, cutting the signal to the rotators and lowering the bridge. And let's not forget, it also resets the timer so the logic can be triggered again if Connie didn't cross the bridge the first time. Phew! Isn't logic exhilarating? Take your time digesting all that. Logic is easier to read if you route your wires. Grab wires with X to change their paths. You can move the gadgets around too by grabbing them with R2. Feel free to test it out in play mode, but don't leave the scene just yet. I have one more thing to show you.